Okay, let's jump right in today. We're tackling something really important, something that affects all of us, really, protecting children's health.
Absolutely. And specifically, looking at serious diseases like childhood cancer.
Exactly. It's thankfully rare, compared to adult cancers, but it's still a major cause of death for kids globally.
And worryingly, the data shows the incidence rate has been slowly increasing worldwide since maybe the 80s.
Which makes you wonder, right, in that whole complex picture of prevention, could there be something really fundamental, something natural that might offer some protection?
It's a huge question. Researchers, parents, health experts, everyone's been trying to figure out which early life factors might shift that risk.
And breastfeeding keeps coming up in that conversation, doesn't it?
It does. You see individual studies, but they often give different results or focus on just one cancer type. It's hard to see the big picture sometimes.
Right, which is why this deep dive is, I think, going to be really useful. We're not just looking at one piece of research.
No, we're unpacking a major systematic review and, importantly, a dose-response meta-analysis that came out in 2021.
And this wasn't small scale. They pulled together data from hundreds of studies.
Hundreds. Yeah, involving hundreds of thousands of participants. It's like knitting together decades of research to spot the overall patterns.
Okay, so our mission today, cut through all that data. What did this massive analysis really find about breastfeeding and different childhood cancers?
What are the solid findings? Where are the interesting wrinkles?
And why? What are the potential reasons behind any links they found? We want to give you that clear, informed shortcut.
Definitely. And the best place to start has to be the strongest finding they reported.
Which relates to the most common childhood cancer.
Leukemia. That's where the evidence seemed most robust.
Okay, let's dig into that main finding then, this huge meta-analysis. It showed a pretty strong link between breastfeeding and a lower risk of childhood leukemia.
That's right. When they pooled all the relevant studies looking specifically at leukemia, the association was statistically significant.
How significant are we talking?
Well, just looking at ever breastfed versus never or only occasionally breastfed, the analysis pointed to about a 23% lower risk for the breastfed group.
23%, that's substantial.
It is. And they saw a very similar figure, also 23% lower risk, when they compared kids breastfed for the longest reported durations versus the shortest durations in those studies.
And this wasn't just based on a couple of studies.
Oh no. For leukemia specifically, this finding was based on combining data from 33 different studies. That's a solid foundation for that particular result.
Okay, so breastfeeding seems linked to lower leukemia risk overall, but you mentioned dose response. That's where it gets really interesting, right? They looked beyond just yes or no.
Exactly. They asked, does the duration, how long a child is breastfed, make a difference? Does more breastfeeding mean more protection against leukemia?
And what did they find? Is it a simple more is better situation?
Well, this is a key part of their analysis. They found clear evidence that duration does matter for leukemia risk. But interestingly, it showed a nonlinear relationship.
Nonlinear. Okay, break that down for us. What does that mean in simple terms?
Sure. So a linear relationship would be like every extra month gives you the exact same tiny bit more protection, like climbing steps.
Okay.
Nonlinear means the pattern is different. Maybe the benefit increases more steeply at first, or maybe it levels off, or maybe there's even a point of maximum benefit. It's not a straight line graph.
Got it. So the protective effect isn't necessarily constant month after month. Did their analysis suggest like a peak, a duration where the protection seemed strongest based on all that pooled data?
It did, actually. Their modeling suggested the most protective effect against childhood leukemia was estimated around a duration of 9.6 months.
9.6 months. Wow.
Yeah, and at that specific duration, the calculated odds ratio suggested something like a 34% lower risk compared to never being breastfed.
34% lower risk, specifically around that 9-10 month mark. That's quite specific. What about more common durations people aim for, like, say, 6 months or a year?
Good question. Yes, those showed significant reductions too. The overall reduced risk was statistically significant for any duration between about 4.4 months and 15 months.
Okay.
And they calculated specifics. Around 6 months of breastfeeding was linked to roughly a 20% lower risk.
20% at 6 months?
Yes, and for 12 months, it was associated with about a 27% lower risk.
And they give those ranges too, right? The confidence intervals.
Exactly. So for 6 months, the estimate is 20%, but they're 95% confident the true value is probably between 15% and 25%. For 12 months, the estimate is 27%, with the range being 22% to 33%.
Which just adds weight, doesn't it? It shows it's not just one fluke number, but a likely range based on the data.
Precisely. It means the finding is pretty robust. That level of detail from the dose-response analysis is so valuable, it moves beyond just a general statement.
Yeah, it suggests there might be, specific durations linked to the strongest observed protection against leukemia, at least according to this huge analysis.
Based on synthesizing all that existing data, yes.
Okay, so leukemia is the big headline, a clear dose-dependent link. But the study looked wider, right? What about other childhood cancers? Did they see similar patterns?
This is where things get a bit more nuanced. The leukemia finding was strong, but for other cancers, the picture wasn't as clear-cut.
Okay, like neuroblastoma, did they look at that?
They did. And for neuroblastoma, they found what they called a suggestive inverse association.
Suggestive, meaning?
Meaning the numbers pointed towards a lower risk, but maybe didn't meet the strictest statistical thresholds for certainty, or were based on less data. Comparing ever breastfed to never occasional was linked to a 41% lower risk estimate.
41%, that sounds really high.
It does, yeah. And comparing longest versus shortest duration gave about a 39% lower risk estimate. Promising numbers.
But there's a but.
There's a but. The authors are very careful here. This analysis for neuroblastoma was based on only 4 studies.
Okay. Much less data than for leukemia.
Much less. So while the direction of the association is suggestive, it's just not as statistically solid. They clearly state more research is needed to confirm if that link is real.
Makes sense. Promising hint, but need more evidence. What about the other cancers they included? Lymphoma, brain tumors.
Right. For all the others, they examined lymphoma, brain tumors, soft tissue sarcoma, nephroblastoma, which is a kidney cancer.
Retinoblastoma too. Eye cancer.
Retinoblastoma, yes, and germ cell tumors.
Yeah.
For all of those, the meta-analysis found no statistically significant associations with breastfeeding.
So, based on pooling all the available studies they included, the evidence just didn't show a clear protective link for those cancers.
Correct. It highlights that the potential benefit seen in this analysis isn't necessarily universal across all childhood cancers. It seems more specific, particularly for leukemia.
That's a really important distinction to make.
Absolutely. And even digging into that strong leukemia finding, the study doesn't just stop there. It explores the nuances.
Like why the results might vary between different studies. You mentioned heterogeneity.
Exactly. Heterogeneity just means the results weren't perfectly identical across all the individual studies they pooled. There was some variation, especially for leukemia and lymphoma.
And did they have ideas why?
They did try to investigate using something called meta-regression. It suggested a couple of things might be playing a role. Geographic location, for instance.
How so?
Results sometimes looked a bit different in studies from Asia compared to Europe or North America. Also, how different studies define non-breastfeeding or occasional breastfeeding, that reference group seemed to matter.
Which kind of makes sense, right? Breastfeeding practices, how long people typically breastfeed, exclusivity, that can vary a lot culturally and geographically.
Precisely. Pooling data from different contexts can introduce that kind of variation.
What about the quality of the studies themselves? Did that play a role?
They looked at that too. The analysis included studies with different quality scores and, importantly, different designs. Most were case control studies.
And case control, that's where you compare kids who have the cancer to kids who don't, and look back at exposures like breastfeeding.
Correct. Valuable, especially for rare diseases, but they have potential pitfalls.
Like remembering things accurately, recall bias.
Recall bias is a big one. A mother whose child is sick might think harder or differently about past events like breastfeeding duration compared to a mother of a healthy child. There's also selection bias, how participants are chosen.
So not quite as robust as following people forward in time, like in a cohort study.
Generally, cohort studies are considered stronger for establishing links because you measure exposure before the outcome happens. But they're hard and expensive for rare diseases.
Did the limitations of case control studies weaken the overall finding for leukemia here?
Well, the authors acknowledge these limitations and the possibility of residual confounding other factors not perfectly accounted for. But, crucially, they did find that when they looked specifically at the higher quality leukemia studies included in their analysis, the results were consistent with the overall findings.
Okay. So even the studies designed to minimize those biases were showing the same protective association.
Pretty much, yes. Which adds a layer of confidence to that leukemia link.
That is good to know. Okay, so we have the association, especially with leukemia. Now, the really fascinating bit. the why. How might breastfeeding actually offer this protection?
Right, the biological mechanisms. The study delves into several possibilities, particularly for leukemia.
What's going on inside the baby's body?
A lot, potentially. One major area is just the incredible composition of breast milk itself. It's far more than just food.
It's packed with other stuff.
Packed with immunologically active components, anti-inflammatory factors, things that are thought to really shape how the infant's immune system develops in those critical early months.
So it's like training the immune system,
Yeah.
guiding it.
That's a great way to put it. They even mention specific substances found in breast milk, like something called TRAIL.
Trail.
Yeah, TRAIL. It stands for tumor necrosis, factor-related apoptosis-inducing ligand. It influences cell death pathways.
Yeah.
And another one called Hamlet.
Hamlet, like the play.
Yeah, HAMLET. Human alpha-lactalbumin made lethal to tumor cells. It's actually shown anti-cancer activity in lab settings.
Wow. So breast milk contains compounds that might directly fight or prevent cancer cells.
That's one hypothesis, yes. These components could act directly or indirectly by influencing the immune system's response.
Incredible. Are there other ways it might work?
Definitely. They also talk about the transfer of maternal stem cells through breast milk, another potential way to stimulate or modulate the baby's developing immune system.
Stem cells too. Okay.
And a huge factor they highlight is how breast milk shapes the infant's gut microbiome.
Ah, the microbiome again. It seems connected to everything. How does the gut link to leukemia risk?
Well, this ties into leading theories about how leukemia, especially all acute lymphoblastic leukemia, the most common type, might develop.
Like the Greaves hypothesis.
Exactly, like Greaves' delayed infection hypothesis. It suggests all L might result from an abnormal immune response to common infections later in childhood, particularly in kids whose immune systems weren't properly primed early on.
Prime.
Yet exposed to the right microbial and immune signals early in life. Breast milk could be crucial for that priming. By providing immune factors, shaping a healthy gut microbiome, and maybe even transferring maternal cells, it helps program the immune system correctly.
So it's setting up the immune system to respond appropriately later on, potentially reducing the risk of it reacting abnormally in a way that could lead to leukemia.
That's the essence of the theory, yes.
Yeah.
And the strong association found in this meta-analysis between breastfeeding and reduced leukemia risk really fits well with that biological plausibility.
It paints a really complex picture of early life programming.
It really does.
Okay, this analysis sounds incredibly thorough, pulling so much data together. But, like all research, it must have its limitations. What did the authors flag?
They were definitely upfront about limitations. We mentioned the heterogeneity, the variation between studies, although they tried to explore reasons for it.
Right, and the small number of studies for some cancers.
Exactly. For neuroblastoma, and especially for the other cancers where they found no link, like sarcomas or brain tumors, the number of available studies was small.
Meaning they might just not have had enough data to detect a real effect if one exists, like not enough statistical power.
Precisely. So for those less common cancers, you can't definitively say there's no link based on this study alone, just that the current pooled evidence didn't show one.
What else? Did they mention challenges with measuring the breastfeeding dose?
Yes, what's called exposure misclassification. When you pool studies, they might have categorized duration differently, like 6-12 months versus specific numbers. Trying to standardize that for a dose-response analysis introduces some unavoidable imprecision.
And finer details. Like, did it matter if breastfeeding was exclusive versus mixed with formula? Or differences between boys and girls?
Unfortunately, the data from the original studies usually wasn't detailed or consistent enough to allow the meta-analysis to look into those specific questions. Big gaps for future research.
Okay. So given those findings and limitations, what's the path forward? What kind of research is needed next?
Well, the authors conclude that while their leukemia findings really strengthen the existing evidence, we still need more high-quality research, especially to confirm that suggestive neuroblastoma link.
And to get clearer answers for the less common cancers where the data was just too limited this time around.
Exactly. And ideally, to understand that nonlinear duration effect for leukemia more fully.
What would more high-quality research look like, ideally?
The gold standard would be large, prospective cohort studies following thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, of children from birth.
Tracking breastfeeding details accurately from the start.
And then seeing who develops cancer over many, many years. That minimizes recall bias and helps establish timing.
But as you said, incredibly difficult and expensive for rare diseases like childhood cancer. Extremely challenging, yes. So, while that's the ideal, researchers also need to keep refining methods for analyzing existing data and conducting the best possible observational studies.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. What's the main takeaway from this deep dive?
I think the clearest message from this huge 2021 meta-analysis is the strong synthesized evidence linking breastfeeding to a reduced risk of childhood leukemia.
And not just any link, but one where duration seems to matter, with maybe the biggest protective effect estimated around that 9 or 10-month mark, but significant benefits seen at 6 months and 12 months, too.
Absolutely. It also puts a flag on neuroblastoma as needing more investigation, a suggestive link there.
But for many other childhood cancers looked at here, the current pooled evidence didn't show a clear protective association. Correct. It really underscores the value of these large meta-analyses. They take all that scattered research and give us a much clearer, more reliable picture than single studies alone.
It definitely reinforces the public health message about the potential long-term benefits of breastfeeding, specifically pointing to leukemia risk based on this extensive data synthesis.
It provides a solid quantitative summary, moving beyond just general advice.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. We talked about those fascinating potential reasons why the immune system development, those specific components in breast milk, the gut microbiome.
Yeah, the how.
So if we can really understand how breastfeeding provides this protection against leukemia at a biological level, could that knowledge open up completely new ways to think about prevention? Maybe even new strategies inspired by those mechanisms?
It makes you really think about the incredible power of those earliest environmental exposures, like nutrition and microbes, in shaping our long-term health trajectory in ways we're only just beginning to fully appreciate. A lot left to uncover there.